You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have a major update here that finally put some restrictions on ICE. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, Brian, an important ruling from a federal judge in Chicago. Judge Sarah Ellis has ordered that any ICE officers or immigration enforcement officers who are operating in Chicago must wear body-worn cameras, and she went one step further. She said they must be turned on. In other words, she's not giving them any wiggle room or the opportunity to play games in an attempt to evade the order. Judge Ellis's voice is now joining a chorus of voices from federal court judges who are, one, let's just say, skeptical with respect to what DOJ lawyers are saying when they're dragged into court to see if, these injunctions, these restraining orders should be issued. And two, they seem pretty concerned about the law enforcement tactics that they are seeing out in the streets. It wasn't long ago that Judge Karen Immergut in Portland said that the assertions being made by Trump and his administration and his DOJ lawyers are untethered to the facts. And you had Judge April Perry, who was also presiding over some litigation with respect to whether National Guard troops should be permitted to be deployed, to the streets of Illinois. She said that, it is Donald Trump who is pouring fuel on a fire that he started. And now it looks like Judge Sarah Ellis, based on what she has been seeing, not only in her courtroom, but with her own two eyes, because here is a quote from Judge Ellis. She said, "I live in Chicago, if folks haven't noticed, and I'm not blind," right? And then she talked about how she saw images of street confrontations that involved tear gas and other tactics being used by immigration officers. And so she was having none of it. So she ordered that they will be required to wear body-worn camera. And this is going to be really a twofer because, one, I have personal experience with body-worn cameras being ordered and used as part of law enforcement efforts in Washington, D.C. I lived through that as a federal prosecutor, and I saw how it changed police conduct. One, it tends to deter misconduct in the first instance, and two, it captures what's going on in the street so that footage can be used by anybody who alleges that they've had their rights violated. That footage can be used in court, and it will actually, maybe it's a threefer, because it will also help identify the officer who is engaged in potentially inappropriate conduct, because they may be masked, but they're going to have a unique body-worn camera assigned to them so that footage can be tracked back to the officer who was caught on camera. So this is a really important development. Of course, it's one I don't expect the Trump administration will take lying down.
The reality is that we have seen everything that these immigration officials and these ICE agents are doing. We've seen all of the footage from Americans who have recorded this stuff and put it online. It has no deterrent effect, certainly as far as the federal government is concerned. So what difference would it make if this footage of a lawless secret police force if this footage is being taken from their own body-worn cameras or from other people, third parties, and then just being thrown online? It's not changing any of the facts in terms of how they comport themselves. So what is the point of doing this?
So I actually, I'll disagree with you in part. First of all, I don't think we've seen everything that they've been doing in the streets. I think we have seen a relatively small percentage of what they've been doing when citizens are, quick with their cell phone cameras or journalists happen to have their video cameras rolling. But I also think it becomes somewhat different when officers themselves have government-issued body-worn cameras on their chest, capturing their every word, capturing their every action. It does, in my experience, it does tend to deter conduct. Now, it's not going to deter everybody that ICE is bringing on board with $50,000 bonuses, people who probably couldn't be gainfully employed anywhere else, certainly not in law enforcement, but it will have an impact, and that impact, I think, will serve to the benefit of what's going on in the streets right now. It's not going to eradicate ICE misconduct, but I do think it will tamp it down.
Whose responsibility is it to hold these ICE agents when they behave in a way that's counter to what they should be doing? Whose responsibility is it to actually hold them to account? Because the DOJ knows what's happening. In large part, these people are acting in accordance with how the DOJ wants them to act. And so, if they're caught doing something wrong and the DOJ stands behind them, what actually changes at the end of the day?
Yeah, so in the before times when the rule of law was actually something the Department of Justice cared about, let me answer the question that question first. Yeah. So in the before times, it would be the supervisors of these officers, these ICE officers, these immigration officers who were working in the street. It would be up to their supervisory structure to hold them accountable. It would be up to the FBI, for example, to investigate allegations of excessive force. It would be up to the Department of Justice to use federal prosecutors to address any violations of the law by federal law enforcement officers. We, over time, have prosecuted plenty of federal law enforcement officers, whether from ICE, from Customs Enforcement, from the FBI, if FBI officers violated the law, and ATF and DEA and on and on. That is DOJ's duty, their sworn responsibility. Now, Brian, all of that is in the before times. Now, as you point out, Pam Bondi seems completely content to let ICE run roughshod over not only the rights of immigrants and American citizens, but the Constitution more broadly. So there are other ways for these folks to be held accountable. If you commit a crime, if you violate somebody's right, if you engage in excessive force, if you assault somebody while you're carrying out your ICE duties, guess what? You have also committed a state crime in the state where that conduct occurred. So state prosecutors in Illinois, in Oregon, in California, and elsewhere can absolutely investigate, and if the evidence supports it, bring charges against these people. And I hope to hell they begin stepping up and doing more of that. And then sort of the third way to hold somebody accountable is with civil suits that can be brought by people who have their constitutional rights, their civil rights violated. It can be an uphill climb because of qualified immunity that officers generally enjoy if they're acting within the scope of their official duties. So there are some accountability mechanisms out there, but I will say they don't seem to be, employed as robustly as I think they could be and I think they should be.
Glenn, if you have one of these immigration officers or ICE agents who acts kind of in a way that's extrajudicial, maybe in a violation of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, does that then mean that they are acting outside the bounds of their oath of office and their job, and therefore have some legal exposure if somebody wants to bring a lawsuit against them, where they can't just say, hey, I'm covered here by qualified immunity, there's nothing you can do, I was just doing my job? Like, that's not their job. Their job is not to violate the U.S. Constitution. Their job is to presumably carry out these ICE activities within the bounds of the Constitution. And so how does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer to your question is maybe it opens them up to a suit because they're acting outside their lawful authority or the scope of their official duties. And I don't mean for that answer to sound flip because, the law builds into it some cushion for mistakes. A police officer can act in the street in a way that some judge a year down the road in a motions hearing decides, the officer kind of stepped a toe over the Fourth Amendment prohibition against an unreasonable search and seizure. But officers sometimes act in good faith and just make the wrong decision in the heat of the moment. Under those circumstances, they don't lose their qualified immunity. However, if they are involved in intentional conduct that, there is no reasonable argument, is simply a mistake, they're just out and out violating the constitutional rights of both immigrants and American citizens day after day, flagrantly. And, when they're caught on video, engaged in what is obviously excessive force and inappropriate law enforcement tactics, that is when that qualified immunity can fall away and they can be held civilly responsible, so the person can actually sue them in their personal capacity, and they can be made to pay out any money judgment that the aggrieved person may win. So it's not an all or nothing proposition. It always boils down to the facts and the evidence that is introduced during the course of litigation of these issues.
As far as you know, have there been any civil suits against any of these ICE agents for abuses of the Constitution or civil liberties?
Yes, there are actually multiple suits. I tried to get a comprehensive answer to that question in recent days. I think it's fair to say there are dozens of suits that have been brought on behalf of individuals, both undocumented immigrants and documented immigrants and American citizens who have had their constitutional rights violated by these immigration enforcement operations. So I do know that there are, I think, at least a couple of dozen suits that have been filed against ICE officers.
Okay, well, I'm sure this isn't the last that we'll hear of this story. So for those who are watching right now, if you'd like to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. It's a great way to support our work, a great way to support independent media, and it is 100% free. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.